So in 10 minutes, I thought I would focus on 3 concepts, food for thought, in terms of working with intimate partner violence and sexual violence against women. The first one is life cycle. The second one is intersectional. And the third one is culturally competent care. If we manage individually, but most importantly, I think institutionally, to ally these 3 concepts, I think we are moving and would be moving in an efficient way in addressing what I consider personally as a pandemic problem. Intimate partner violence, and most generally violence towards women and violence towards refugee and immigrant women is highly prevalent, and it is consistently less counted or included in statistics as much as the real prevalence of the phenomenon. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind. It is also important to keep in mind that when we address intimate partner violence individually, but again institutionally, we need to constantly move between the micro and the macro level if we want to understand the breadth, but the depth also of influence, but also of resilience and strength that it has on women's lives, but also on the children of these women who are exposed to this phenomenon, and on community lives and community organization, the way that communities organize their lives. I invite you really to think about intimate partner violence in a life cycle. So if you have a patient that arrives at 52 years old and is experiencing violence or intimate partner violence, I agree that we need to focus on the here and now when we work in terms of intervention. But we need to understand that several of these women have been inscribed in a structural life cycle form of violence that starts pre-birth with some examples of practices such as, sex-selective abortion, but can continue through the life cycle in different ways and in different forms. So I believe it's very important to look also at the trajectory of violence and how this woman has been inscribed in this trajectory. It does not mean that all women have had or experienced violence throughout their life cycle, but they can come from structures where this life cycle systemic violence exists towards women. So just to kind of, this is when I say we're micro with her, but we're keeping that macro image of, a generational, like a developmental perspective in a way. When we focus on women refugees and women migrants more specifically, we also need not only to look at it in a trajectory way, in a developmental way, but we also need to look at it in a phase way, from pre-migration, through migration, and, just fleeing combat zones, through arrival to host society, and again in host society. And, there are enough studies that document the different kinds of violence that women refugees and women migrants experience. It does not mean that we need to question our patients on all these issues. These, again, are just food for thoughts. Keep open, keep, the question going on, and trying to think. I'm just trying to invite us to think in a broader framework, but also keeping in touch with how it articulates with the daily lives of the women we're working with. Statistics show that sexual violence, intimate partner violence is significantly underreported. Often the cases that we work with are the cases that are at the tip of the iceberg, that have either been reported by police, have been reported by surrounding, have become so severe that women are not able anymore to handle the situation, are very scared for their children, or want to make a move to protect their children. But behind that, I think we do need to keep an iceberg image. That does not mean that we need to panic, that this is a phenomenon that every woman is experiencing. But from my informal work with communities, I do end up noticing that it is much, much more prevalent than we think. And I'm not saying that based on my Western conceptualization of what violence towards women is, I am saying that based on what women themselves consider as practices they don't like. They're not happy with these practices and would like to change. The second, so we're thinking about life trajectory. So the second thing that we need to think about, food for thought, is intersectionality. I think that if you encounter or are interested in the issue of violence towards women, you have to become familiar with the theory of intersectionality. The reason is that when we tend to work with intimate partner violence or sexual violence, we focus on the violence. And that's okay. We need to focus on that. However, and I love Lord's statement in saying there is no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. So we need to understand that many refugee, minority, and migrant women, when they experience a specific form of violence, this specific form of violence articulates with different other forms and systems of oppressions, does not express itself, and is not manifested to her if based on, it varies with gender, identity, race does not exist, but skin color, level of education, etc. So there are multiple systems of oppression that interact and that influence the way that she is surviving the violence, but also the way that she can access to care and the way that care articulates. We do not intervene in similar ways based on, for example, a patient who comes from a given social class, has access to education, has access to care, with another woman who's just arriving refugee, experiencing discrimination, experiencing exclusion, experiencing intimate partner violence, being isolated, scared to lose her children if youth protection gets involved, etc. So just, broaden the perspective constantly and think about those intersecting dimensions of her identity and of her life. Because if there is one thing that we do not want to do as practitioners, is be structurally and violent in our interventions. We do not want to produce more harm, more exclusion, more economic disadvantage. So if we only focus on the violence issue, we may do more harm accidentally, Also, maybe consider that there are some specific vulnerability zones for immigrant and refugee women that make them, trying to find the English word, that gives en français, sur lequel, le conjoint violent peut jouer, okay? So some specific elements, like, for example, status, right? Refugee immigration status. A non-immigrant woman, if her partner wants to be violent, he's not going to use the status issue. She's a citizen. So there are certain specific vulnerability points that can be used not only by the partner, but also by the community, by the surrounding, sometimes even by organizational structures, to kind of keep that woman in this oppressed situation. So it would be good to become a little bit more familiar about what are those fragility zones that are specific to migrant and refugee women that can be used. And the third issue is culturally competent care. So culturally competent care, I think, has been a lot addressed by my colleagues, but in terms of studies and research around how to address best intimate and sexual violence towards immigrant and refugee women, or in a culturally diverse society, there are several barriers, but one of the barriers that systematically is stated, not only by women, but actually also by men who perpetrate violence, is the issue of culturally sensitive or culturally competent care. This culturally competent care can be carried by ourselves individually, but it's not going to move fast if we do not pressure our organizations to become more culturally competent. We cannot do this job on our own. This is, intimate partner violence, sexual violence towards women is a societal, structural, systemic problem. We cannot address it individually. We have to make our organizations move in order to address that. And every single sector has to be involved in the response to this phenomenon. So, of course, advocacy is always at the center of our work, but some of the most important ways in addressing those barriers, and I will not necessarily, go through them. You probably have been exposed to many of these barriers that immigrant and refugee women face. Again, lack of culturally and linguistically appropriate services, particularly among also immigrants and refugees living in, let's say, rural or less bigger cities of the country, Canada. And at the individual level, culturally competent care can start with very simple practices, such as making sure that information is available in the different languages that are spoken by the immigrant and refugee, such as simple child support or child care when she's coming to our office, translation interpretation services. So we can arrive and not scare the people who kind of have this higher ranks in our organization with coming with this big word as culturally competent care that scares everyone. There are some very simple things we can apply on a daily basis in our organizational practices that can improve cultural competent care. And then after that, that can make the different people working within our organization more open to more in-depth practice and training around culturally competent. So that's it. 3 ideas, again, simply just food for thought to have a more holistic outlook at this phenomenon. Thank you.